Those of you who've been following me lately will know about the experiments I've been doing, which involve mixing various metals into the clay bodies I work with. I've already tested hammer scale produced from working with steel, and some bronze filings too, all of which has been very kindly sent to me by Alex Pohl, a friend of mine, a blacksmith and an author. He does it all, really, to exacting standards too. And together with his latest care package of metals, he included this cookbook he put together that contains 40 recipes by 21 chefs, all cooked with the objects he creates, which is just such an original idea for a book. So thank you, Alex. As for the metals he sent, there's some 925 sterling silver in these minute, sharp-looking shards. I've no idea what the silver itself will do when fired in reduction, but it also contains about 7.5% copper, which, such as with my previous tests, such as bronze, creates a red blush on the glaze. But I've no idea what the silver itself will do. I'm imagining black or green specks that are very molten due to its lower melting point, which means I'm going to have to be relatively careful about how I bisque fire these. The other metal he's sent isn't really one specific type. In fact, it's rather a strange thing. These are antique fishhooks Alex found in the Arctic that are high iron and possibly contain brass too. They've been ground up into various grades, and I'm going to see if I can throw a bowl with some really chunky parts in it, which I know is going to be an utter pain, but it might be interesting to see just what I can get away with. I've tested both of these materials before, iron and brass, but never mixed together like so. And by throwing pots with such large inclusions, I should get some really dramatic results. Although I can't really throw with something this size mixed into the clay. I could press it into the stoneware afterwards, or simply rest it on the surface, but that sort of defeats the point of what I'm trying to do. The problem with additions this size is that as the clay dries and shrinks around them, it causes the clay to crack. But if I cut them into small enough chunks, I might be able to get away with it. For these tests, I'm going to be using my high iron stoneware clay body, as it's relatively simple and doesn't contain many inclusions. I have been working my way through rather a lot of reclaim recently, which is lovely and smooth to throw with, but it also contains tiny chunks of hammer scale and bits of bronze too, from previous tests, but I don't want those to contaminate these, so I'll be using this untarnished stuff. Weighed out into lumps that are just over 1 pound, some 470 grams each. I wedged them up a tiny bit and then smeared the lumps out, and it's onto these flat surfaces that I'll sprinkle the metals. With these 2 lumps of clay, I'll make some very simple bowls, as I feel like they're quite a good shape to test things like this on. I cut up those larger chunks into smaller pieces, and added both larger fragments and some of the finer powder. The silver, on the other hand, feels really sharp and splintery at this stage, but the particles are so fine that once really mixed into the stoneware, I'm sure I'll barely be able to feel them when throwing this lump on the potter's wheel. These 2 lumps of clay are then rolled up and wedged to fully incorporate and spread out the metal evenly throughout them. And I mark each one so I know which lump is which, before heading over to the wheel to do one last task before I begin throwing, and that's to clean up the wheel tray, or at least 90% of it. As I don't know how these materials will fire, I'm going to collect the scraps from the throwing and the trimming process, so they aren't incorporated into my larger bucket of reclaim. I'm sure they'd probably be fine, but it's better being safe than sorry. I'm beginning with the lump that contained the fishhooks, and centering this lump was totally fine, as all of those chunks of metal just sink into the large mass of clay. I think it's when I start throwing the walls of this piece that it's really going to become a problem. I just hope I'm lucky enough that no large chunk of metal decides to stay right on the lip of the bowl, as it will probably create a tear, which I'll inevitably have to patch up and fix. It's the first pull with a bowl that's often the hardest, as normally there's such a thick expanse of clay that's being squeezed between my fingers, so I use lots of water and I take it slowly to gradually press that thick donut of clay into thinner walls above. I've also, purposefully, left an awful lot of material in the base of this pot, probably about 2 centimeters or so, just under an inch, as I want these bowls to match the others I make, which at the moment all happen to have quite tall feet. This way, if these pots are successful, they can be displayed or exhibited alongside the rest of my work as interesting one-off individuals, and it's at this point that I could really start to feel the lumps of metal beneath my fingers. So with the walls at the correct height, I first scrape away clay from around the foot. This way, if the pressure on the outside causes the interior shape to deform slightly, I'll be able to press it down when I scrape clean the interior surface next. Well, I knew that would happen. Inevitably, in the shaping of this pot, be it in the throwing or the trimming, some of those specks of metal are going to be torn out. So I'm either going to have to shove them back in, or smooth over them carefully, or even fill up the holes and scratches left once the pot has turned leather hard. There's just no way I could avoid it unless I ended up making pots that just didn't fit into my style of work, which isn't something I particularly like to do. It's looking rough, but I should be able to fix most of this later, after the pot has turned leather hard. But let's see. Maybe I can use a chamois leather to soften the rim and hide that piece of metal that's created a pock mark in the lip. I'm also going to soften the interior form with a sponge, like so, which actually did a surprisingly good job. Next, I'm going to set the throwing gauge to the rim. This way at least the two tests will be the same. I then slide a twisted metal wire beneath it, and as there's so much excess material in the foot, I can just prod my fingers into the base to pry the pot away with. That's one bowl thrown, the tricky one, as I think the piece containing silver is going to be much easier to make. In fact, I can barely feel the silver at all, although I did accidentally make the base of this piece too thin. So I stuck a piece of soft stoneware into more silver, which I'll give a quick mix, then place into the bottom of the bowl onto an area that's been scraped clean of slip. This way they stick properly. It's then slowly pushed in with the wheel rotating slightly, and then eventually, once flat enough, I'll use a turning tool to remove the excess and to create a lovely smooth curve in the base of the bowl once again. You can do this on any shape really, if you've made the base too thin, although it's easier to do it when the clays are roughly the same consistency, as there are times when I've tried to plug a hole in a trimmed bowl with new, soft clay, but 50% of the time it cracks as it dries. I'll then use a kidney to smooth over the entire interior surface. And to remove the worst of the throwing rings on the inside, I hold the kidney in place and press in from the outside with my fingertips, forcing the clay against that curved profile of the rib. You can just about see a few of the flecks of silver, and in a way I wish they stayed like this once fired. I mean, there's a chance they do, but I'm not too hopeful. Before I wire the pot off, I lift the pointer out of the way, as I don't want the delicate rim to collide with it. It's why you want things like rubber, or even a paintbrush tip, as a pointer, as if they are made from something such as metal or wood, when they do collide, they can cause quite a bit of damage. And with the test bowls thrown, I'll now let them sit out overnight with some plastic draped over them. This way the rims don't dry out too much. I'm also collecting all the larger chunks of reclaim, so that they can be kept separate from the rest of my reclaimed clay. I uncover the pots first thing the following morning and assess them, and if the rims are too dry, I'll quickly dunk them in water, being careful not to get the lower half wet, as the thicker bases always remain damper for longer, which is also why they're flipped over, so this portion of the vessel is given ample time to dry out throughout the morning. In best case scenarios, I'll flip the pots over before I go home overnight, but that doesn't always happen. The first thing I do is fill any holes or scratches left by firmly smearing soft stoneware into them. I'm probably going to try lightly trimming the interior, which means that all of this could be for nothing, but let's see. I can't help myself. The portion in the rim though has to be fixed, as otherwise there'll be an indentation present in the finished object. I'm not trying to fix it perfectly at this point. In fact, I'm making sure the clay sits slightly proud, and then, say in half an hour, once this material has dried up a bit, I'll be able to trim it back flush. The bowl with the fish hooks really is all over the place, but hopefully through trimming I should be able to create something that has a bit more finesse and lightness to it, despite being filled with lots of hunks of metal. I had to trim the base flat initially, as the rim was wavering slightly. The base was then slipped, the pot placed on top of this, tap centered, and then sealed with a plastic kidney. I can already tell this is going to be troublesome. A bowl like this normally takes me about 2 or 3 minutes to finish, but this will easily take longer, as there's going to be a lot of stopping and starting to repair damage, as bits of metal are torn out or they're dragged across the surface. You can hear those fish hooks colliding with the blade, and I think for this reason I won't be using my best tools. This straight portion on the outside is more or less finished, so at this stage I'll fill up any hole caused by a piece of metal being torn away. Then I'll use the soft side of a plastic or metal kidney to smooth them over. This is something I'm stopping to do every couple of minutes, which made trimming this bowl rather tedious. And yes, there's another wound in the rim, caused by another shard being stripped out, but let's see, I should be able to plug this and smooth it. But really, I won't be surprised if this bowl cracks or splits as it dries and is then fired. With the interior, rim and top of the outside portion trimmed, I now slice the pot off the wheel and begin work on the base. I think trimming the underside will be easier, but the only thing I'm slightly worried about is how pushing on the lumps of iron from the outside might affect the shape of the pot in the inside, as some of the chunks are almost the same thickness as the wall, and part of me is thinking that when this pot has been bisque fired, if it survives that at least, I should just sand the surface wherever there's any inconsistencies, as at that point there's no give in the vessel, and I don't have to worry about my actions affecting some other part of the pot, whereas trying to get it perfect at this stage means I could fuss and fuss for ages, fixing one thing and then another and then another until it's perfect. In fact, that relates nicely to a video I'm going to put together in the future. I can't make it yet, as the objects in question are still under embargo, but essentially I figured out that the most detailed shaping these pieces needed was easiest and safest to do once they were bisque fired, as it was much less likely that the pots would chip or distort after being bisque fired to 1000 degrees. But you'll have to wait for that. I think it should come out sometime around Christmas. Next, for the base, I measure how wide I want the foot using this antique pair of calipers, which I love. This way, when I trim the other bowl, I can make sure the foot on that piece is the same. It's not so useful on this scale with only 2 bowls, but when I have 30 or 40 pieces to get through, it's incredibly helpful. For this part of the trimming process, I'm pushing down from on top with a spinner. This just helps to keep the vessel pinned in place, which in this instance is really handy, as when the blade catches on those pieces of metal, it imparts quite a lot of force on the rest of the piece, enough to cause the pot to move around even with all these restraints, and without a spinner I'm pretty sure the bowl would leap up and fling itself across the wheel head. The measurement I originally set was a touch too narrow, so I'll adjust it and make it larger. This way the foot works proportionally with the rest of the vessel, and it won't be so narrow that the bowl easily tips over to either side. I've now switched to one of my fancier tools, a tungsten carbide turner, which I'm using very lightly just to skim the surface and to define the shape. If I feel like it's catching too much, I'll stop using it. Such as with this chunk, for instance, which for now I'm going to press back into the body and cover, but this inclusion is so large, if it were to melt fully, I'm pretty sure it could leave a hole in the bowl, which, as long as the rest of the pot fires successfully, opens the doors into some rather interesting ways of fixing it, be it with resin to leave a clear hole, which could be interesting, or sometimes I take epoxy resin and mix smashed, powdered stoneware clay that's been reduction fired into it. The hole can then be plugged and sanded over. This works especially well on the foot rings of pots, and sometimes when I've done this in the past you can barely tell that there's anything wrong with it. Or I could simply try something like kintsugi, filling the hole with a touch of gold. Strangely enough, the foot on this was really easy to turn, save for the fact that that bit of iron did get dragged out eventually. So I'm simply going to plug it with clay and then smooth it over. But if you think you would be interested in a video that goes over how I repair pots, let me know, as that could be an interesting video to put together. With the foot trimmed, the last thing I did is just burnish over the interior surface, as there were a few lumps and bumps caused where iron had been pressed from the outside in. It's not the smoothest vessel, there's some chattering and some strange marks here and there, and here are some of those bumps I'll sand away once the pot's been bisque fired. That's if the vessel doesn't crack as it firms up to bone dry, in which case I'll have to reevaluate this idea, as working with metal inclusions this large might be too ambitious. Now, trimming the silver bowl was really straightforward. I could barely feel the chunks of metal, save for when my tool scraped over them, and they left long, tiny incisions in the surface. But, on the whole, this is just like trimming any other pot. So, with that in mind, there is something else I want to talk about, which isn't related to the bowl or this video, really. And that's my work as a potter and a YouTuber, and balancing the two. I never set out making videos on this platform with the intention of becoming a full-time YouTuber, but that has now somehow happened. I never thought boring videos of pots would somehow gain the traction they have. At the end of the day, it's pottery that underpins everything I do, and I always wanted the videos that I produce for this platform to sort of just follow along my day-to-day practice, rather than the videos being what dictates my practice, if that makes sense. It's for that reason that in this video you won't see the objects fired yet, because I simply haven't got to that stage yet. But this is also what I'm doing at the moment, and it's what excites me, so I want to make a video about it, even though I can't show you the finished product yet. And I know that some of you will find that annoying, but it might give you a reason to subscribe too, so that you can check back in later to see the finished pieces. I suppose the thing I'm constantly weighing up is what's better. Say producing just a single video per month that's more carefully put together, edited and narrated, and shows the entire process from thrown to fired. Or I continue at my current pace, uploading a video a week that follows more closely what I'm actually doing week to week. Basically, I'm at a bit of a crossroads. Editing and narrating these usually takes up a day per week, not to mention all the time spent filming, which is something I do every single day. Anyway, I suppose what I'm asking you is what you would prefer. With this current method, not every video is as exciting as the last, but it's more truthful to my practice. Or I could make videos that are longer and more intentional, but there's far less of them. And those of you who are watching and have made it this far are probably the die-hard viewers. So I'd really love to hear what you think, and if you're kind enough to leave a comment or your opinion, I'd love to read it. Back to the bowl at hand, the vessel encrusted with hundreds of tiny shards of silver. You can just about see some of them. In fact, on the outside I think the tungsten carbide has severed a number of them. I really hope they stay bright in silver, but I'll be covering these with glazes, so it's going to be really interesting to see how the metal reacts to all the other minerals and metals and chemicals that cover them. The same goes for the iron, the fishhooks, which, whilst I know what iron does, typically I'm not entirely sure how it'll fire on this scale. And to see that, you'll have to check back in with me in a couple of weeks or months' time, once I get around firing the kilns again. But until then, thank you so much for taking your time to watch, and as always, I'll see you next time.